Hello everyone, and welcome back to our channel dedicated to fascinating stories. Before we dive into this new episode, take a moment to get comfortable. Maybe you're already in bed. Maybe you're simply unwinding after a long day. So, take a deep breath, relax your shoulders, and let yourself drift along. And as we get ready to travel together, don't forget, subscribe only if you truly enjoy what I do. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always incredible to see who joins us from all around the world. Tonight, we're going to talk about something that transcends all civilizations, all eras, and all cultures: seduction. This universal art of pleasing, of attracting, of building connections. Whether in a prehistoric cave, in the golden palaces of the pharaohs, under the northern lights of the Vikings, or in the perfumed ballrooms of Versailles, humanity has never stopped inventing strategies to seduce. Sometimes discreet, sometimes spectacular, sometimes tender, sometimes cruel, but always revealing of their time. What we're about to explore together is a true fresco of human history, seen through the prism of seduction. From the most primitive gestures to the refined intrigues of royal courts, through tribal dances, poems, adornments, stolen glances, all the way to modern strategies. At each stage, we'll discover how men and women sought to charm, to convince, to conquer, and how each attempt speaks volumes about their world. So, get ready, because this journey will be long, rich, and at times surprising. Together, we'll travel across the ages and uncover the countless ways in which humanity has played the game of love and desire. And to begin, we head straight into the dawn of time, to an age when nothing yet existed of what we know today. Imagine a world with no cities, no paved roads, no telephones, no buildings, no artificial light. Only dense forests, wild rivers, the crack of branches underfoot, and the constant murmur of nature. Our ancestors, the hunter-gatherers, lived in this setting. Their daily life, survival, finding food, protecting themselves from the cold, avoiding predators. But within this equation, there was something else too. Coming closer, finding a partner, passing on their bloodline, building a lineage. Seduction, at that time, was not a distraction. It was as much a matter of survival as of desire. The first gestures of courtship obviously had nothing to do with moonlit dates, perfumed letters, or Tinder messages. Here, everything played out in the open, under the sky, in the midst of the tribe. Hunting, strength, dexterity. This is what mattered. A man able to bring back a heavy prey, to master fire, or to defend his clan inspired admiration and naturally attracted attention. But beware. Sheer brutality was not enough. Women observed, evaluated. A hunter too aggressive or unstable could be cast aside despite his strength. What seduced was a subtle balance of skill, generosity, and respect for the group's rules. We know this today thanks to archaeological digs and the study of traditional societies. For example, in the Blombos caves of South Africa, engraved ochre blocks dating back over 70 years already bear witness to a will of aesthetic expression. These pigments were used to paint the body, trace symbols, perhaps even create ornaments. Covering oneself in red was a way to attract the eye, to signal an identity. It was useless for hunting a buffalo, but it carried social value and seductive value. Another fascinating example comes from the Bismoon site in Morocco, where pierced seashells, 80 years old, were discovered. These beads, strung into necklaces, had no practical function. They existed to be seen. To offer a necklace of shining shells, or to wear it proudly around the neck, was to display status, to signal one's ability to access rare resources, and thus, one's value as a partner. Imagine the scene. Around the fire, a woman whose necklace softly clinks with every gesture, drawing glances. In truth, not so different from jewelry worn today to seduce. But seduction was not only about appearance. Sharing food was at its core. In a world where every calorie mattered, offering food was equivalent to an act of love. Anthropologists studying the Hadza of Tanzania, one of the last remaining hunter-gatherer peoples, show that men seduce by bringing back game and sharing it. What impresses is not only killing an animal, but the generosity of distributing the meat. The same logic must have existed among our ancestors. A rare fruit, a piece of honey found after a long trek, or a fish caught in a dangerous river. These offerings were powerful gestures. Dance and music also played a central role. Long before modern instruments, our ancestors struck stones, tapped sticks against the ground, and sang together. Around the fire, the tribe vibrated to the rhythm of sound. It was more than entertainment. It was a showcase. Whoever could improvise a song, keep the rhythm the longest, dance with the most energy, showed vitality. Researchers note that in the dances of the San people of the Kalahari, feathers and beads accentuate body movements, making every gesture more visible. Already, seduction relied on performance. And then there were the looks, the subtle gestures, a hand lingering as food is shared, a laugh by the fire, a sought closeness during a night watch. Seduction was cautious, too direct, and it could scare, too timid, and it could go unnoticed. It required balance, patience. Even then, seduction was a game of signals, of implicit codes. Yet, among these rituals, some practices appear strange, almost bewildering. In Germany, at the site of Dolní Věstonice, around 30 years old, clay figurines of women with exaggerated forms were found, known as prehistoric Venuses. Some are round, with accentuated hips, breasts, and bellies. Their purpose remains mysterious. Were they symbols of fertility, objects of seduction, or even erotic amulets exchanged as promises of union? Imagine a hunter handing one of these small statuettes to a woman as proof of his desire for offspring. It is troubling because it shows that seduction already reached beyond the present moment. It projected the idea of a future, of a lineage, and sometimes seduction took even more unexpected forms. A legend from certain African oral traditions tells of a man who, unable to compete in hunting, found another way to impress. Each night, he secretly climbed a vertiginous cliff where rare flowers grew, impossible to reach without immense courage. These flowers had no use. They did not feed, they did not heal. But he returned with a handful of glowing petals under the moon, and discreetly laid them before the shelter of the woman he desired. Day after day, the young woman discovered these improbable offerings. It was not brute strength that spoke, but audacity, creativity, and a mysterious attention. According to the story, she eventually chose him, and their children were known in the tribe as those of the cliff flowers. Was it real fact or myth? Impossible to say. But it reminds us that even in the Paleolithic, seduction could be as strange as it was poetic. So no, the love of the first humans was not brutal, as sometimes caricatured. It was not a man dragging a woman by the hair. It was a subtle art, a blend of generosity, creativity, strength, and delicacy. A necklace of shells shining under the moonlight, an improvised dance whose gestures captivate, a rare fruit offered as proof of care, or a clay figurine slipped into a companion's hand as a silent promise. That is what seduction could be at the dawn of humanity. Vital, mysterious, and sometimes profoundly strange. With the rise of agriculture, everything changed. Humanity was no longer condemned to wander endlessly from hunt to harvest. The first villages formed, food surpluses allowed the specialization of tasks, and little by little, complex social structures emerged. In this new world, seduction was no longer limited to proving strength or generosity with an offering of game. It rose, became codified, ritualized. It turned into a language serving families, clans, and kingdoms. It is in Mesopotamia that we find the first love texts in history, carved into clay in cuneiform writing nearly 4,000 years ago. They carry words that still unsettle us today, sometimes startlingly direct. A priestess named Enheduanna implored the goddess Inanna to guide her in her surges of passion. Other tablets recount the chants of the sacred marriage, a ceremony where the king symbolically united with a priestess to ensure the fertility of the land. Here, seduction went beyond the private sphere. It became a political and religious tool. This idea of love, tied to fertility and social status, found an echo in Egypt, where seduction took sensory and refined forms. The tomb frescoes depict couples offering each other lotus flowers, symbols of love and rebirth. Banquets were key scenes: music, date wine, dancers with slow gestures. Men and women wore perfumed cones set on their heads made of fat and fragrant oils that slowly melted, releasing their scent. Seduction here appealed to the sense of smell as much as to sight. Medical papyri also reveal recipes for ointments meant to awaken desire, true ancestors of aphrodisiacs. Meanwhile, to the east, in the Indus Valley, seduction was staged through small objects and talismans. Steadite seals depict embracing couples, dating back more than 4,000 years. Although their exact meaning remains uncertain, some scholars believe they were fertility charms or ritual representations of union. These practices reveal a similar trend observed elsewhere. Seduction was becoming codified, almost ritualistic. And this codification also appeared in China, where poetry and the arts became subtle instruments of attraction. Under the Zhou dynasty, the poems of the Shijing recount gestures of courtship: flowers picked, rivers crossed, secret meetings in the fields. Offering a decorated fan, composing a melody on the chin, or calligraphing a refined character, all these served to seduce with delicacy. Unlike the raw strength or material generosity of hunter-gatherer societies, here seduction passed through mastery of the arts and restraint, reinforcing social prestige. But even in these refined societies, certain practices remained surprisingly strange, reminding us that creativity in seduction has never known limits. With the rise of cities and kingdoms, seduction ceased to be only an intimate act. It became a social and political matter. Family alliances, arranged marriages, consolidation of power. Behind each gesture of courtship, each poem, each offering, lay strategic stakes. Seduction became a social instrument and, at times, a weapon. With the rise of the Greek city-states and the Roman city-states, seduction took on a far more complex social and cultural dimension. Love and desire were no longer confined to the household or to survival. They became embedded in civic, artistic, and philosophical contexts. Every gesture, every word, every performance could serve as a tool not only to win a partner, but also to gain prestige and influence. In Athens, seduction was practiced as much through the mind as through the body. The symposia banquets, reserved exclusively for men, were places where conversation, poetry, and rhetoric became instruments of charm. Young men competed to display their intelligence and education. Poets such as Anacreon or Sappho, on the island of Lesbos, explored emotions and desire in poems dedicated to beauty, passion, and sensual pleasures. Some philosophers, like Socrates according to Xenophon, engaged in amorous dialogues where eloquence and subtlety of argument weighed more than strength or wealth. To seduce was to know how to listen, to reply with wit and finesse, and to build intellectual intimacy. Yet, not all practices were rational or classical. At Delphi, rituals dedicated to Aphrodite included unusual offerings meant to catch the eye of a partner, rare fruits, miniature statuettes, and even rudimentary mirrors to reflect the sunlight onto the beloved's face. These gestures, reminiscent of Paleolithic shells or Africa's impossible flowers, show that imagination has always been central to seduction. In Rome, seduction intertwined with grandeur and displays of power. Roman banquets were sumptuous affairs, exotic dishes, fine tapestries, musicians, dancers, and entertainers. Seduction unfolded as a constant spectacle. Offering a lavish feast, a rare perfume, or a jewel imported from the East was both a declaration of status and an attempt to captivate the heart of a partner. The Emperor Elagabalus, 218–222 CE, is said to have hosted dinners where, in order to seduce his guests or favorites, he released cascades of flowers from the palace ceiling. At times, the petals were so numerous that some guests nearly suffocated, a seduction that was spectacular, dangerous, and wholly theatrical. The Romans also invented codified love correspondence. Ovid, in his Art of Love, outlined how to write letters, give gifts, or use words to seduce with subtlety and persistence. It was not merely about declaring love. Every word was carefully chosen to persuade, enchant, and maintain attention. In paved streets and public baths, seduction also played out in daily life. The baths were places to display one's beauty, body, and elegance, and to observe others within a socially codified setting. Gestures, posture, the intensity of one's gaze all became a silent language. Some historians note that romances were born at a fountain's edge, in a bathing corridor, or during public games and competitions. At this time, seduction was never simply a spontaneous act. Strategy dominated, political alliances, gains in prestige, and inheritance intertwined with matters of the heart. And yet, surprising stories abounded. A Roman matron, for example, might seduce not by beauty alone, but by orchestrating a scene where music, lighting, perfume, and carefully prepared conversation created an irresistible atmosphere. Thus, in Greece as in Rome, seduction became a multi-dimensional art, physical, intellectual, sensory, and social. The simple gestures of the Paleolithic evolved into complex rituals, performances, and strategies of power. Yet, despite the sophistication, the essence remained unchanged. To seduce is to create a connection, to awaken attention, and, at times, to surprise through boldness or creativity. At the dawn of the Middle Ages, seduction took on a codified and theatrical turn. Unlike the instinctive and spontaneous gestures of hunter-gatherers or the spectacles of the Greeks and Romans, medieval seduction was embedded within a strict social framework. Here, love and desire were not merely matters of the heart. They were tied to honor, social status, and reputation. In the courts of the nobility, love became a noble art, codified by the ideals of chivalry. Troubadours and trouvères sang poems dedicated to ladies, eloquently describing the beauty, virtue, and grace of the chosen one. To seduce was to master words, music, and poetry, all while respecting a precise set of rules. Courtly love demanded that the knight serve his lady with loyalty, sometimes from afar, often in discretion and refinement. The poet Chrétien de Troyes, for example, described in his romances how knights earned their ladies' attention not through brute force, but through heroic deeds and symbolic gestures. Offering a glove, a ring, or an embroidered ribbon could be worth as much as a victorious battle. Every object carried a subtle message of fidelity and desire. Some practices may seem puzzling today, yet they carried very specific meaning. In certain French courts of the 12th century, there existed the ritual of the tournaments of love. Knights competed not only to demonstrate their skill in combat, but also to seduce publicly, performing feats or taking part in poetic jousts before their chosen lady. These spectacular gestures combined bravery with theatricality. At the court of Eleanor of Aquitaine, one knight is said to have challenged a captive bear during a celebration to prove his courage and impress his lady. The story recounts that he subdued the beast unarmed, though historians still debate whether the tale was fact or embellished legend. Either way, it shows how medieval seduction could blend daring, danger, and spectacle. Seduction was not confined to physical exploits. Poets and musicians played an essential role. The words of songs or verses were chosen carefully, each metaphor and rhyme carrying a coded message. To offer a song or a stanza could forge a lasting bond, and ladies judged a suitor's worth as much by his words as by his actions. Jewels, rings, embroidered gloves, or roses were not only tokens of seduction but also symbols of commitment. To give a ring could signal a promise of loyalty, and every gesture was scrutinized by the court. Even the color of a ribbon might indicate a particular intention. These subtle codes reveal that seduction in the Middle Ages was a delicate dance between desire, social standing, and reputation. And at times, medieval creativity in seduction took unexpected forms. Some noble ladies, in order to test the ingenuity of their suitors, would set riddles or absurd challenges, to fetch a rare object within a set time, to compose a poem in a single night, or to perform a song while juggling. These trials, sometimes dangerous, sometimes ridiculous, were opportunities to display courage, intelligence, and devotion. Thus, the Middle Ages transformed seduction into a social spectacle, codifying gestures, words, and objects. Poetry, bravery, and staged performance replaced natural offerings or primitive dances, yet the principle remained the same. To seduce was to capture attention, to prove one's worth, and to create a memorable bond. During the Renaissance, seduction took on a refined and strategic dimension. The rediscovery of antiquity, the rise of the arts, and the expansion of princely courts transformed love into a subtle blend of art, intelligence, and diplomacy. Seduction was no longer merely a matter of courage or status. It became a powerful social instrument, capable of influencing alliances, marriages, and fortunes. Writing and the visual arts became essential tools in this game of seduction. Poets such as Pierre de Ronsard or Clément Marot composed sonnets dedicated to their beloved, where every word and metaphor carried a precise and subtle message. Likewise, in Italian courts, presenting an oil-painted portrait could convey as much as a verbal declaration. Miniatures and refined portraits captured not only beauty but also the status and sophistication of the giver, transforming art into a weapon of seduction as powerful as a passionate speech. A concrete example is Isabella d'Este, Marchioness of Mantua, who collected letters and portraits offered by her admirers. Painters like Titian or Andrea Mantegna created works specifically intended to seduce or flatter a courtly lady, demonstrating that seduction could simultaneously be an artistic and political act. European courts became spaces of codified sociability, where words often outweighed gestures. In these salons, a skillful suitor carefully chose his words, wielding humor, flattery, and cultural knowledge to impress. Conversations about philosophy, literature, or music were never trivial. They showcased intelligence, refinement, and the ability to be a partner worthy of respect and admiration. At the court of Francis I, for example, some knights and courtiers employed theatricalized dialogues to seduce. Coded letters, sometimes accompanied by enigmatic objects such as engraved rings or rare flowers, circulated within the courts, reflecting a genuine love diplomacy where every gesture and every word carried weight. At this time, objects also became powerful symbols in the art of seduction. An engraved ring, a jewelry box adorned with precious stones, or a rare perfume could convey more than a simple verbal declaration. The symbolism of colors and materials played an essential role. Rubies for passion, emeralds for fidelity, silk for refinement. Courtiers learned to decode these subtle messages and to convey them without offense, while respecting the strict social codes of the era. One remarkable example. In certain Italian courts, suitors would present mechanical watches with hidden mechanisms that only functioned after solving a riddle or performing a particular ritual. These objects were as much proofs of wealth and ingenuity as gestures of seduction. Dance, meanwhile, remained a central tool in the art of seduction, but it too became codified. Courtly balls imposed strict rules: who could invite whom, how to approach, how to show interest without breaching decorum. Dancers competed in technique and elegance to attract attention, and every movement became a subtle message of desire or respect. At the court of Louis XIV, for instance, the masked ball allowed daring encounters under the cover of anonymity. Masks added layers of mystery and intrigue. A glance exchanged, a hand brushing another, and seduction unfolded in the shadows, balanced between rigid codes and calculated boldness. What distinguishes the Renaissance and the 17th century from earlier periods is the strategic dimension of seduction. Seducing was no longer just about pleasure or beauty. It had become a means of reinforcing status, influencing alliances, and securing inheritances. Romantic intrigues in European courts were never trivial. They combined intelligence, audacity, and patience, with every gesture and word carefully calculated. Seduction thus transformed into a total art. It combined literature, painting, objects, dance, and speech, becoming a complex, subtle, sometimes dangerous, yet always fascinating game. Thus, seduction during the Renaissance and the 17th century became a true reflection of the era, bold, refined, strategic, and deeply embedded in social and political dynamics. It was no longer only love at stake, but also power, influence, and survival in a world where every gesture and word mattered. In the 18th century, seduction took on a profoundly intellectual turn. The rise of the Enlightenment, along with the spread of ideas about reason, sociability, and emotion, radically transformed the way people courted. Seduction was no longer simply an aesthetic or artistic act. It became an exercise of the mind, conversation, and moral subtlety. From then on, the codes of seduction evolved, taking a new form shaped by the innovative ideas of the era. In Europe's major cities, literary and philosophical salons became essential meeting places. These spaces welcomed men and women eager to seduce through the refinement of their intellect and mastery of the arts of conversation. While physical beauty remained appreciated, intelligence, knowledge, and wit now became paramount. Seduction transformed into a genuine game of the mind, where speech and culture were highlighted. A precise example is Madame de Pompadour, favorite of Louis XV, who used her intellect as much as her beauty to exercise influence. She hosted salons where philosophers, artists, and diplomats mingled. Every conversation, every exchange became a tool of seduction and social power. Her correspondence with Voltaire and Diderot perfectly illustrates how intelligence could captivate as much as appearance. This phenomenon clearly demonstrates that seduction in the 18th century rested on intellectual foundations, no longer relying solely on gestures or looks. At the same time, novels and letters became refined instruments of seduction. Codified correspondences, poems, and sentimental stories served to demonstrate a suitor's wit, sensitivity, and delicacy. Unlike earlier eras, where seduction was often immediate, it now developed over time through patience and the subtlety of words. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, in his letters to Madame de Warens, perfectly embodies this new form of seduction, blending sincerity with intellectual refinement. Every word was carefully chosen to enchant through depth and sensitivity, showing that seduction had become both a moral and social art. It was no longer only physical seduction, but a true seduction of the mind. Moreover, as in previous centuries, gifts continued to play an important role in gestures of seduction. However, in the 18th century, their symbolism became more precise. A fan, a perfume, or a piece of jewelry became a sign of thoughtful attention, shared taste, or subtle complicity. These objects were meticulously selected to express a particular feeling, seducing through detail and elegance. For instance, in France and England, enthusiasts of courtship offered fans painted with romantic scenes, sometimes accompanied by coded messages inside. These messages allowed discreet communication of romantic interest while respecting the social conventions of the time. Dance also continued to play a central role in the games of seduction, but it became more codified. Balls, where nobles and bourgeois mingled, imposed strict rules, the order of invitations, attire, and gestures. Mastery of steps and movements became a sign of culture and refinement, capable of seducing while demonstrating social belonging. In Vienna, at the balls of the Austrian aristocracy, some young men employed complex choreographies to capture a young lady's attention. Dance instructors taught codified movements, with every step able to signify an intention or romantic interest. In this way, seduction became an art of precision, almost scientific in its method. Thus, in the 18th century, seduction required balance and intelligence. It was no longer about strength, nor even merely beauty, but about demonstrating refinement, wit, and patience. Seduction became a dialogue, an exchange of subtle signs where gesture, word, and object combined to create enduring charm. This phenomenon reflects a society in which romantic relationships had become sophisticated and rationalized, where every action was calculated, every word weighed. In conclusion, from the court of Louis XIV to that of Louis XV, seduction became codified, rationalized, and theorized. It now incorporated the art of conversation, knowledge, taste, and subtlety. Every action was carefully considered, yet retained a human and emotional brilliance. In the Age of Enlightenment, seduction thus became a living art, combining reason, emotion, and creativity. In the 19th century, seduction underwent a profound transformation under the influence of strict social codes, moral conventions, and the rise of the bourgeoisie. While the Enlightenment had prized intellect and conversation, the 19th century codified every gesture, from posture to correspondence, from the ballroom to the salon. Seduction became a meticulous, almost ceremonial art. First, balls and bodily codes played a central role in this process. Balls were essential meeting places for courtship and seduction. Every gesture was observed and interpreted: the invitation to dance, the way one held a partner, the choice of step or movement. Dance became a codified language where a simple glance could signify interest, hesitation, or rejection. For example, in Vienna and Paris, young aristocrats followed dance manuals detailing how to present a hand, take a step forward or backward, and even slightly turn the body to subtly express feelings. Consequently, a clumsy young man could lose all credibility, while perfect mastery of the waltz or quadrille could ensure lasting seduction. Next, Romantic correspondence, particularly through letters and diaries, became an essential tool of seduction. For young men and women of the bourgeoisie, letters allowed them to express feelings and intentions without violating social conventions. Every word was carefully chosen to demonstrate politeness, sensitivity, and refinement, while subtly seducing the recipient. A historical anecdote illustrates this. George Sand and Alfred de Musset maintained a famous correspondence in which each letter revealed a blend of passion, humor, and intellectual subtlety. In this way, the letters of the era testify to seduction based on patience, verbal creativity, and the staged intimacy of the mind. Additionally, gifts and symbols held great importance during this period. Offering a gift in the 19th century was never trivial. Flowers, fans, jewelry, and handkerchiefs carried meaning and coded messages. The language of flowers, for example, allowed people to discreetly convey feelings. A red rose signified passionate love, a violet modesty, and mimosa delicacy. To illustrate, in Parisian salons, a man might discreetly slip a violet into a young woman's corsage to signal his interest without violating social propriety. These careful gestures were as much tests of patience as demonstrations of refinement. Finally, the 19th century saw the rise of the sentimental novel, notably through the works of Jane Austen, the Brontë sisters, and Balzac, which explored seduction through dialogue, misunderstandings, and social codes. Readers discovered detailed seduction strategies, codified meetings, subtle attentions, and calculated gestures to spark interest. Take Pride and Prejudice, for instance. Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy practice a slow, measured seduction where conversations, gestures, and silences carry deep meaning. Every exchanged glance or compliment becomes a subtle victory in the social game of courtship. Moreover, the influence of moral conventions was omnipresent. Seduction in the 19th century was also about respecting social codes and morality. Reputation, particularly for women, was a precious asset. Any gesture deemed too direct could be considered inappropriate or jeopardize marriage prospects. Prudence and subtlety thus became essential. Seduction became codified, theorized, and ritualized. While creativity and intellect continued to be valued, they were always exercised within the strict framework of social rules. Consequently, giving a flower, mastering a dance, or writing a subtle letter became strategic arts where every detail mattered. The 19th century perfectly illustrates the transition between the Enlightenment's art of seduction and modern strategies, where appearance, language, and patience combine to create a lasting and refined charm. From the early 20th century, social changes were already becoming apparent. The rise of the middle class and the growth of cities transformed spaces for meeting and courting. Literary salons and cafes, inherited from the 19th century, remained privileged places for interaction, but their role evolved. Women, increasingly present in public life thanks to suffragist movements, were no longer mere spectators. They could choose, express preferences, and influence the course of seduction. Newspapers and illustrated magazines now offered advice on how to attract attention, blending fashion, conversation, and social behavior. In the 1,920 seconds and 1,930 seconds, cinema and radio became powerful cultural vectors. The glamorous figures of Hollywood elegant men, sophisticated women, set aesthetic and behavioral standards. Seduction, once confined to the immediate community, became a collective ideal, shared worldwide. The way people spoke, dressed, gave gifts, or danced was codified according to these new media models. The world wars also had a unique impact on courtship behaviors. The forced separation of millions altered romantic interactions. Letters sent from the front, sometimes illustrated with small drawings or poems, became an essential tool for courting from afar. The scarcity of encounters and the awareness of life's fragility made every gesture and word all the more precious. Some soldiers' letters reveal seduction strategies where humor, tenderness, and promises of a shared future played a central role. After World War II, the rise of the consumer society further modified the codes of seduction. Dinners at restaurants, cinema outings, vacations, and leisure activities became opportunities to meet and woo. The emergence of advertising and popular culture popularized new objects of desire. Perfumes, clothing, cars, all became symbols of prestige and tools for seduction. The 20th century, therefore, is characterized by the introduction of material and cultural symbols into the art of seducing. Then came the digital era at the turn of the 21st century. Mobile phones, and later smartphones, radically changed the way people met. Early online forums, followed by social networks and dating apps, allowed courtship from a distance, the creation of appealing profiles, and the selection of partners with unprecedented precision. Seduction strategies adapted to this new visibility. Photos, descriptions, and digital interactions became as powerful tools of persuasion as gestures, gifts, or rituals of the past. In the 21st century, seduction is no longer confined to a physical space. Videos, instant messages, Instagram stories, or profiles on Tinder and Bumble enable flirting in a global virtual arena. Codes evolve rapidly. Humor, creativity in messages, displayed authenticity, or mastery of one's online image have become essential. Yet, despite these transformations, some ancestral principles persist: generosity, attention to the other, and creativity in gestures or words. In this contemporary context, strategies can sometimes seem bewildering. Some people stage elaborate scenarios on social media to attract attention, travel experiences, original activities, carefully composed photos. Others focus on immediacy, direct dialogue, and instant emotional connection. Just as in the Paleolithic era, there are multiple ways to capture attention, adapted to society and the available means. Thus, from the 20th to the 21st century, seduction has undergone a profound transformation. From elegant salons to glowing screens, from handwritten letters to instant messages, it has always aimed to create a connection, impress, and allure. While the tools and spaces change, the essence remains the same, demonstrating one's value, generosity, and creativity, and establishing a bond with another. Contemporary seduction, digital or physical, is ultimately a modern continuation of the gestures of our ancestors. And so, we arrive at the end of this long journey through the centuries. From the first fires lit in the prehistoric night to the artificial lights of our modern cities, we have followed the countless ways in which men and women have sought to seduce one another. The dance of shells, poems engraved on marble, glittering balls, and now messages exchanged across a screen. All of it, at heart, has been variations on the same melody, the desire to connect. Tonight, you can close your eyes, thinking of this long chain that links the first hunter-gatherers to our lives today. A chain woven of glances, gestures, words, and promises. A chain that continues with every encounter, every smile, every outstretched hand. So, let the weight of the centuries gently fade away. Let your thoughts slow, like a fire gradually dying in the heart of the night. Breathe calmly. You have traveled through an immense story, and now it is time to rest. I wish you a deep, peaceful sleep, filled with soft and luminous dreams.